Hello all. Today we're going to talk about the idea of rhetoric, which is the central focus of the introduction chapters 1 and 2 in the textbook. And this is one of those terms you've probably heard thrown around a lot in a lot of different ways, but essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about rhetoric is the way we communicate. So it's all the things that are not functional parts of language. So when I say functional, I'm thinking about things like grammar, syntax, these kinds of very basic, this is correct, this is not correct. So rhetoric is functionally the art of communication. So backing up a step, Kenneth Burke argues, and this is referenced in the introduction, that we as humans have a basic need to communicate. This is one of the defining characteristics of people, is that we have messages and we want to share those messages with other people. So, rhetoric is style, so my choices that I might make in order to convince somebody of the correctness of my position, to convince my husband that we should eat at a particular restaurant instead of another restaurant, to convince my employer that I should be paid more. All of these things, I'm going to make a series of choices about how I'm going to best convince people to go along with what I want to do. So, rhetoric is also the recognition that communication happens between two or more parties. And all that means is, very simply, thinking about your audience. So, who am I talking to? What things are they going to find most persuasive? So, I argue, as do a lot of writing scholars, that every act of communication is essentially persuasive. Sometimes we're trying to get something. Hey Mom, I really need a puppy or I'm going to die. Puppies are very important. I need a puppy. So that's very clearly persuasive. That is, I have a particular goal that I'm trying to get somebody to help me to achieve. So, very simple persuasion. However, think about things like research papers you may have written for your other English classes or for your science class, or a lab report, or something like that. That doesn't seem inherently persuasive, does it? However, even when we're just presenting information, we're presenting it to somebody. So again, we're back to the idea that communication happens between two parties. It isn't just written and then nothing happens with it. So, what we're trying to do, if nothing else, is to convince or persuade the reader to keep reading, that we as communicators have something that is worth their time and effort. So, if we grant the idea that every act of communication is essentially persuasive, Wayne Booth, another scholar, makes an interesting argument. The two most important tools we have for communication are language and violence. So take a minute, think about some things that you've seen where people are trying to persuade other people to take action. This may be something you want to bring up in a discussion post or something along those lines, but language is certainly, especially if we compare it with violence, our best way of communicating ideas and convincing other people to behave in a certain way. So, if we want to communicate effectively, we have to know our audience. So, I joke that this is the only thing. If you remember only one thing from my composition classes, remember this. The audience is the most important thing to know when you are communicating. So, what does it mean to know your audience? How do you do this? There are a couple different ways. First thing we can do is listen to existing conversations. So, if we are meeting somebody for the first time, we may want to listen more than we talk. So imagine a first date. So you've gone on a date, everything is going well, but all you do is talk, and your date cannot get a word in edgewise. At the end of the date, they're going to know a lot about you, but you're going to know very little about them. So, we listen. Listening is the most important thing we can do to understand the other person and also to understand what somebody has already said. The metaphor that we use for this is sort of like going into a party. So you walk into a party or a meeting, there's a group of people having a conversation that's already been going on. You don't just walk into the middle of it and start talking, because you don't know what they've already said, you don't know what their opinions are about things. You stand there for a few minutes, you listen, and then you contribute. So listening is probably one of the most important things we can do when we are establishing our audience. The other thing we need to have when we're working with an audience is empathy. And empathy is a word you may or may not be familiar with. It is closely related to sympathy. Sympathy is when we feel badly for somebody. Empathy is when we understand why they have done something. We understand their position. So, for instance, if you have been healthy your entire life, you've never broken a bone, and then your friend comes up to you with a cast on their arm and they say, "I fell when I was skateboarding." You're going to feel sympathy for them, probably. You're going to say, "Wow, that sucks." But you're not going to feel empathy. You're not going to be able to understand what has occurred with them. Conversely, you may feel empathy for somebody, but not sympathy. So, if you are, well, let's take this class for example. If you come to me and you say, "Hi, Dr. C, I went to a really super awesome party last night. It was fantastic. However, I didn't do my homework because I was out until 2 a.m. There is a good chance that I may feel empathy for you. Perhaps at some point I've had a similar experience. However, there's not a great chance that I'm going to feel sympathy for you because you made choices." All right. So, if we look at page 9 in the textbook, under that section it says, "What do you think and why?" This gets us to the idea of acting intentionally. So this is, what do we do with the information we get from listening and from understanding? So we need to think about, what are we doing? Why am I doing this assignment? What can I get from this? This kind of thing. So pay special attention to the section on page 9 that runs on to page 10. And we may have a number of different purposes or intentions for doing a particular project, for communicating in a certain way. But the most important thing to think about when we think about audience is slow down, then contribute. So, one of the ideas that I've seen a lot is this idea of listening to respond. We are very, as you know, Kenneth Burke told us already, we want to communicate. Communicating is awesome. However, sometimes when we listen to people, we're only listening enough to know when we can respond. When do we get to contribute? So that is something we want to do less of. We want to listen in a way, listening to understand rather than just waiting for our turn to get to talk. So, this brings us to Chapter 2, Rhetorical Situations. So we understand our audience. We've listened to them. We've thought about what they have to say. We are all about the audience at this point. Unfortunately, audiences are not stable. Situations change. So what our best friend may behave like in, say, the situation of you guys hanging out versus a situation of him wanting to prepare for a job interview. So, situations change what the audience is doing, how they behave, these kinds of things. So, we need to understand the audience in a general way. We understand our best friend very well, and the purpose specifically. When we combine those two things, then we get the rhetorical situation. So, think about a classroom. You're going to do a lot of communication within a classroom. You're going to participate in discussions. You're going to turn in formal written assignments. You may do some free writing. All of these kinds of things. These are all different rhetorical situations in a classroom. You're going to potentially even have the same audience, but what I expect from you, assuming I am your audience in this scenario, is going to be different depending on the rhetorical situation. If you send me an email, I'm going to have different expectations of it than if you are turning in your final draft of a major assignment, for instance. So, what I'd like you to do is take a look at the checklist on pages 21 through 23. This is essentially a way of walking through the rhetorical situation. And it's one of the reasons I like this textbook is it really breaks down the ideas of what does it mean to think about a rhetorical situation. So we start by thinking about our audience, considering general principles like how are they similar to us, how are they different from us. We think about what we want the audience to do, what they are likely to be interested in. So we break down the audience, and then we think about the purpose. Why am I doing this? What do I want my audience to think, do, or believe at the end of this? Then we think about our stance. So, how are you going to come at this topic? Are you going to be very serious? Are you going to try to use some humor? Are you going to be very angry, sort of, hey, we all need to act immediately or global warming is going to cause X kind of disaster? What's your stance on this? And then we consider the context, medium, and design. So all of these things go into considering a rhetorical situation and deciding how we're going to act based on that analysis. So in the end, what we need to do to communicate effectively is understand who our audience is, what situation that they're currently involved in, and what do we want them to do, think, or believe at the end. So, what I'd like you to do now is go to the modules section of Canvas and take a look at the article that was written by a gentleman talking about a particular rhetorical situation, emailing a professor. Read that and then do the discussion that follows on Canvas.